The contractions were coming every 3 minutes when I made the 13th call. My phone screen was slick with sweat as I pressed his contact again, listening to that familiar ring that had become the soundtrack to my desperation. Voicemail, again. "David, please," I whispered into the phone, my voice cracking as another wave of pain crashed over me. "The baby's coming. I need you to—" The line cut off, 30 seconds. That's all the time his voicemail allowed for what might be the most important message of our marriage. I was alone in our bedroom, gripping the doorframe as my water broke, soaking through my nightgown and pooling on the hardwood floors we'd refinished together 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was about to bring our child into the world in the same room where I'd conceived him. Except this time, the man who'd promised to love and protect us both was somewhere else entirely. His phone apparently more decorative than functional. By the time my neighbor Mrs. Chen drove me to the hospital, my son had decided he couldn't wait any longer. Jackson David Morrison came into this world at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, perfect in every way except for the glaring absence of his father. The delivery room was filled with the efficient bustle of medical professionals, the encouraging voice of my nurse Sarah, and the persistent silence from the man whose name would appear on the birth certificate. I'd been calling David for 6 hours. 6 hours of increasingly frantic messages, texts, and voicemails that apparently weren't worth interrupting whatever was more important than the birth of his firstborn son. But let me back up, because this wasn't really about one night. This was about 3 years of a pattern so systematic, so carefully constructed, that I'd almost convinced myself it was normal. David and I met during my second year of law school. He was finishing his MBA, all confidence and ambition wrapped in expensive suits his parents bought him. I was drowning in student loans and working part-time at a legal aid clinic, surviving on coffee and determination. He seemed impossibly sophisticated to me then, the kind of man who knew about wine pairings and owned more than one tie. "You're going to be someone important," he'd said on our third date, tracing patterns on my hand as we sat in an upscale restaurant I couldn't afford. "I can see it. You have this fire in you." I thought he meant it as a compliment. I thought he was seeing something valuable in me, something worth nurturing. What I didn't understand then was that David had a very specific definition of important, and it had nothing to do with my dreams or ambitions. The first time he missed something crucial, I was graduating summa cum laude from law school. My parents had driven 8 hours from Nebraska to watch me walk across that stage, their first child to graduate from college, let alone law school. David had promised he'd be there, front row, cheering louder than anyone. Instead, he was in Chicago, closing what he called the deal of a lifetime, a merger that would make his name at the consulting firm. "You understand, right, babe?" he'd said over the phone that morning, his voice already distant, already gone. "This is huge for us, for our future." I understood. I always understood. That's what love was, I thought. Understanding when your partner's dreams had to come first. After graduation, I landed a position at Henderson and Associates, a prestigious firm specializing in corporate law. The salary was good, better than good. It was the kind of money that could buy security, the kind my family had never known. David was proud, in his way. He liked introducing me as my girlfriend, the lawyer, at his work functions, liked the way other men looked at him with something approaching envy. But he was less enthusiastic about the hours. The late nights when I'd come home exhausted from depositions and document review. The weekends I spent preparing for trials. The phone calls from clients that interrupted our dinners. "I thought once you got established, it would calm down," he said one evening, not looking up from his laptop as I microwaved leftover takeout at 10 p.m. "Isn't that how it's supposed to work?" I tried to explain that building a career meant sacrifice, that the first few years were always the hardest. He nodded along, but I could see his attention drifting back to his screen, to whatever was more compelling than my explanations. When I made junior partner at 29, 2 years ahead of schedule, David's reaction was telling. "That's great, honey," he said, and I could hear him typing while we talked. "Will this mean more regular hours? Maybe we can finally start thinking about kids." Kids. We'd talked about them in abstract terms, the way young couples do. Someday, when we're ready, when things settle down. But David's version of ready seemed to require me becoming someone else entirely. someone whose career demands wouldn't interfere with his vision of family life. I should have paid more attention to his phrasing. "We can start thinking about kids" wasn't the same as "I want to start a family with you." It was a concession, a checkbox on his timeline that he was finally willing to consider. But I was in love, and love makes you interpret everything in the most generous light possible. We got married the following spring in a ceremony that cost more than my first car. David's parents insisted on paying, which seemed generous until I realized it meant they got to make all the decisions. The venue, the flowers, the guest list. Everything reflected their taste, their social circle, their idea of what their son's wedding should look like. I wanted something smaller, more intimate. Maybe an outdoor ceremony at the botanical gardens where David had proposed. Something that felt like us. "But this is so much more elegant," his mother had said, dismissing my suggestions with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. "Trust me, dear, you'll thank me later." David sided with his mother. "She's planned dozens of these things," he said, when I tried to discuss it with him. "And honestly, Sarah, I'm swamped with the Peterson account. Can't you just let her handle it?" So I let her handle it. I let her handle everything, actually, because that's what you do when you love someone. You compromise. You bend. You make space for what matters to them, even when it means shrinking what matters to you. The wedding was beautiful, I suppose. The photos certainly looked impressive. But standing there in a dress I hadn't chosen, in a venue I didn't love, surrounded by people who barely knew me, I felt like an actress playing a role in someone else's story. The first year of marriage was an adjustment, everyone said. That was normal. The way David's attention seemed to drift during my stories about work. The way he scheduled business trips during important events, my 30th birthday, my parents' anniversary party, the weekend I was supposed to meet my college roommate's new baby. "I'm building something here," he'd explain, and I'd nod because I understood building something. I was doing it too, just in a different field. Once I make senior partner, things will be different. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative, that this was just who he was, how he prioritized, how much space I actually occupied in his life, was too devastating to consider. The pregnancy happened sooner than planned. We weren't trying, but we weren't exactly preventing either. When I saw those two pink lines, my first emotion was pure joy. My second was terror, because I realized I didn't know how David would react. "Wow," he said when I showed him the test. He sat down heavily on our bed, staring at the little plastic stick like it might change its mind. "Wow. Okay, this is happening." Not "I'm so happy" or "I can't wait to meet our baby." Just acknowledgement that something was happening to us, something that would require him to adjust his plans. But he did adjust, in his way. He came to the first ultrasound appointment, marveling at the grainy black and white image of our son. He helped me set up the nursery, though he insisted we hire professionals for the painting because he didn't have time to do it properly. "I want everything to be perfect for him," he said. And I thought maybe this was it. Maybe becoming a father would shift something in David, help him understand what really mattered. The signs were there throughout the pregnancy, if I'd been willing to see them. The way he scheduled increasingly frequent business trips as my due date approached. The way he'd take calls during my doctor's appointments, stepping out into the hallway to discuss quarterly projections while I listened to our son's heartbeat alone. When I was 7 months pregnant, I was put on modified bed rest due to high blood pressure. Nothing serious, my doctor assured me, but I needed to reduce stress and take it easy. I arranged to work from home, turning our spare bedroom into a makeshift office. David's response was immediate and telling. "But who's going to handle dinner? And the laundry? I'm barely keeping up with work as it is." Not "Are you okay?" or "What can I do to help?" His first concern was how my medical needs would impact his convenience. I hired a housekeeper. I ordered groceries online. I reorganized my entire life around minimizing any possible inconvenience to my husband, all while growing his child and managing a full caseload from bed. "You're amazing," he'd say sometimes, usually when he was getting ready to leave for another trip. "I don't know how you do it all." But he never asked how he could help me do less. He never suggested that maybe with a baby coming, he could scale back his travel or delegate some responsibilities. My capability was convenient for him, so he celebrated it instead of questioning whether it was sustainable. The last month of pregnancy was the loneliest time of my life. David was in San Francisco for 2 weeks, then Denver for a week, then back to San Francisco. We'd talk every night, brief conversations where he'd ask how I was feeling, and I'd say, fine, because what else was there to say? That I was scared? That I felt like I was preparing for the most important moment of our lives while he treated it like a minor scheduling inconvenience? The baby's not due for another 3 weeks, he'd say when I mentioned feeling anxious about him being away. And first babies are always late, everyone says so. Everyone. Some mysterious collective of people who apparently knew more about my pregnancy than I did. My due date came and went. David was in Portland, meeting with a potential client he'd been courting for months. Perfect timing, he'd said. I'll be back Friday, and the baby will probably come over the weekend. But babies don't follow business schedules, as I learned at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday when the first contraction hit me like a freight train. Back in that delivery room, holding my son for the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not just love. That was instantaneous and overwhelming. But clarity. Crystalline, perfect clarity about what I was looking at when I looked at my marriage. Jackson was 2 hours old when David finally called back. Sarah, oh my God, I just saw your messages. Is everything okay? Your son was born at 3:47 a.m., I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised me. He's beautiful. He's healthy. He's sleeping. Silence. Then, I'm so sorry, babe. The conference ran late, and then I was in meetings until midnight, and I put my phone on silent. What's his name? I interrupted. What? Your son. What's his name? Another pause. Jackson. Jackson David Morrison. Good. I wasn't sure you'd remember. I hung up before he could respond. David arrived 18 hours later, still in his business suit, carrying flowers from the hospital gift shop and apologies that felt as generic as the roses. He held Jackson awkwardly like he might break, his expensive watch catching the light as he tried to figure out how to support a baby's head. He's perfect, David said, and he meant it. I could see the love in his eyes, genuine and immediate. It gave me hope for about 30 seconds. Then his phone rang. I should take this, he said, already moving toward the door. It's about the Morrison account. The irony of sharing a name with the account that was apparently more urgent than meeting his son wasn't lost on me, and he was gone for 45 minutes. When he came back, Jackson was awake, looking around with those unfocused newborn eyes that somehow seemed to see everything. Sorry, David said. Crisis at work, you know how it is. I did know how it was. I knew exactly how it was. And for the first time in 3 years of marriage, I was seeing it clearly. The next 6 months passed in a blur of sleepless nights, feeding schedules, and the particular exhaustion that comes with caring for a newborn, while your partner treats fatherhood like a hobby he's interested in but doesn't have much time for. David loved Jackson, genuinely. He'd hold him in the evenings, talking to him about baseball and business, while I cleaned bottles and folded tiny clothes. He'd take pictures to show his colleagues, proud of his beautiful son. He bought expensive toys and gadgets, a high-tech baby monitor, a designer stroller, organic everything. But love, I was learning, wasn't the same as partnership. Love wasn't the same as showing up. When Jackson was 3 months old, I went back to work part-time, an arrangement that was generous by corporate law standards but felt impossible in practice. I'd pump milk in my office between client meetings, rush home to feed the baby, then work on briefs while he napped. David's schedule, meanwhile, remained unchanged. If anything, he traveled more, as if Jackson's arrival had given him permission to pursue his career with even more single-minded focus. I'm doing this for them, he'd say when I mentioned feeling overwhelmed. For you and Jackson. I want to provide the best life possible. But provision isn't presence. Security isn't support. And I was beginning to understand that David's version of love was fundamentally transactional. He'd provide money and status and material comfort, and in return, I'd handle everything else. The breaking point came when Jackson was 4 months old. I was supposed to fly to Chicago for a deposition in a case I'd been working on for over a year. It was a big case, the kind that could define my career trajectory. I'd arranged everything carefully. Pumped milk stored in the freezer, detailed instructions for Jackson's schedule, backup plans for emergencies. The night before my flight, David called from Atlanta. Bad news, babe. The Hoffman deal is falling apart. I need to stay through the weekend to salvage it. David, I leave for Chicago tomorrow morning. We talked about this weeks ago. I know, but this is huge, Sarah. We could lose $1 million client, and I could lose my shot at making senior partner. Silence, then, can't you reschedule or send someone else? That's when it hit me with devastating clarity. David genuinely believed that his career emergencies were more important than mine. Not just more urgent, more important. My professional success was nice to have. His was essential. I hired a babysitter for the weekend. It cost more than I made on the case, but I went to Chicago and I nailed that deposition. I proved to myself that I could handle anything, that my career didn't have to suffer because my husband couldn't be relied upon. But I also proved something else, that I was essentially a single mother who happened to share a house with a man who considered himself more of a consultant than a partner. The night everything changed started like dozens of others. Jackson was teething and had been fussy all day. I'd gotten maybe 3 hours of sleep the night before, and I had an early morning client meeting I couldn't reschedule. David was supposed to be home from Denver by 6 p.m. At 7, I called him. Running late, he said over the noise of what sounded like a restaurant. The team wanted to grab dinner to celebrate closing the deal. David, I told you I need to prep for tomorrow's meeting. Jackson's been crying for 2 hours and I haven't had a chance to... Can't you just put him in his crib for a while? Babies cry, Sarah. It's what they do. I've tried that. He's in pain. His teeth are coming in and he needs... Look, I'll be home soon, okay? This is important. Peterson's thinking about expanding our contract. He hung up. I stood in our kitchen, holding my screaming 4-month-old son, and something inside me just shifted, like a gear clicking into place, or a door closing with a final, definitive sound. David walked through our front door at 11:30 p.m., loosening his tie and talking on his phone. I was sitting in the rocking chair in Jackson's nursery, finally having gotten him to sleep after 4 hours of walking, singing, and bouncing. Hey, babe, he whispered, covering his phone. How's the little guy? I looked at him, really looked at him. This man I'd married, this father of my child, this person who had somehow convinced me that his priorities were more important than mine, his time more valuable, his presence optional. Fine, I said. We're both fine. He smiled, relieved, and went back to his call. But we weren't fine. We weren't fine at all. The next morning, while David showered and Jackson napped, I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened my laptop and started researching divorce attorneys. Not because I'd made a decision, but because I needed to understand what my options were. What it would look like to legally extricate myself from a marriage that had become a careful choreography of me working around David's needs while he remained blissfully unaware of mine. Massachusetts was an equitable distribution state, I learned. Assets acquired during marriage were subject to division based on various factors: contribution to the marriage, earning capacity, needs of any children. It was more complex than I'd expected, but then again, I was more prepared than I'd expected too. Over the next weeks, as I researched and planned and tried to imagine a life without David, I started paying attention to things I'd been unconsciously ignoring, like how our finances were structured. We had separate checking accounts but shared savings and investment accounts. The house was in both our names, though I'd put down the larger portion of the down payment using money I'd saved before we met. David's 401k was substantial, but so was mine. We both had significant earning potential, though mine had been artificially limited by the assumption that I'd be handling the majority of childcare responsibilities. The more I learned, the clearer it became that I wasn't as dependent on David as I'd assumed. Financially, professionally, practically, I'd been carrying most of the weight of our marriage while somehow believing I needed him to survive. It was like discovering you've been walking with a limp because you thought you had a broken leg, only to realize the leg was fine. You'd just been favoring it out of habit. But knowledge wasn't action, and I might have stayed in that research phase indefinitely if David hadn't made the decision for me. Jackson was 6 months old when I got offered the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to lead a class action lawsuit against a major pharmaceutical company. It was exactly the kind of high-profile, socially significant case I'd dreamed of when I went to law school. The kind of case that could establish my reputation and let me do good while doing well. It would also require significant travel over the next 8 months, depositions in multiple states, coordination with expert witnesses, potentially a trial that could last weeks. I presented it to David like a partnership decision because that's what I thought we had. A partnership. This is incredible, I said, showing him the case files over dinner. If we win, it could change how these drugs are regulated, and the settlement could be huge. We're talking about helping thousands of people who were harmed. David listened, nodding along, occasionally asking questions about timeline and logistics. He seemed engaged, interested even. Then he asked the question that revealed everything. What does this mean for Jackson? For us? It means I'll need to travel more for the next few months, but I can arrange my schedule around his needs and with some help. Help? A nanny? Or maybe your mom could come stay sometimes when I'm traveling and you're... Sarah. David set down his fork and looked at me with the kind of expression you'd give a child who'd suggested something adorable but impractical. You can't take this case. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I'm sorry. It's too much. Jackson needs his mother. I need you here. This isn't the time for you to be chasing some crusade. Crusade? As if fighting for justice was a hobby I'd picked up instead of the career I'd spent a decade building. David, this is the biggest opportunity I've ever had. This could define my entire career. And Jackson could define your entire life. Isn't that more important? The thing about moments of perfect clarity is that they're rarely dramatic. There's no music swelling, no dramatic lighting, just a quiet recognition that you're seeing something you've been avoiding. I was seeing that David had never intended for me to have a career that might compete with his for attention, resources, or priority. He'd married a lawyer because it sounded impressive, but he'd expected me to function like a lawyer's wife. I'm taking the case, I said quietly. Sarah, be reasonable. We can't both have demanding careers with a baby. One of us has to be the primary parent, and it makes sense for it to be you. You're better at it, and honestly, I make more money. There it was. The equation he'd been working with all along. My time was less valuable. My career was more flexible. My dreams were more optional. I'm taking the case, I repeated. David's face darkened. Then you'll have to figure out childcare on your own because I can't change my schedule. I won't change my schedule. Fine, I said. I will. What David didn't know was that I'd already figured out childcare. I'd researched nannies, interviewed candidates, and found someone perfect, Maria Santos, a former pediatric nurse with impeccable references and a warmth that made Jackson smile immediately. What David also didn't know was that I'd made photocopies of every financial document in our house, bank statements, investment portfolios, tax returns, mortgage papers, insurance policies. I'd stored them in a safe deposit box he didn't know about, along with a detailed record of our assets and debts. I wasn't planning anything specific yet. I was just preparing for possibilities. The pharmaceutical case consumed the next 4 months of my life in the best possible way. It was complex, challenging work that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with law in the first place. I was building something important, fighting for people who needed an advocate, using my skills in service of justice. Maria was wonderful with Jackson, and he thrived under her care. I pumped milk religiously, maintained his schedule even when I was traveling, and called multiple times a day to check in. I was present for him in every way that mattered, even when I wasn't physically present. David, meanwhile, became increasingly resentful. Not of the work itself. He couldn't argue with the prestige of the case or the media attention it was getting, but of my independence. Of the fact that I'd reorganized our life around my career needs instead of his convenience. You're never here anymore, he'd say when I came home from a long day of depositions. I'm here every night that I'm in town, and you travel twice as much as I do. That's different. My travel is necessary. This case of yours is going to trial in 2 months, and we're going to win. He'd shake his head like I was missing something obvious, something fundamental about what our roles were supposed to be. The breakthrough in the case came on a Tuesday in November. We found the smoking gun, internal documents showing that the pharmaceutical company knew about the side effects they'd failed to disclose. It was game over for them, and we all knew it. I called David from my hotel room in Philadelphia, breathless with excitement. "We found it," I said. "The evidence we needed. David, we're going to win this thing. We're going to help so many people and the settlement." "That's great, honey," he said, but his voice was flat, distracted. "Listen, I need to talk to you about something when you get home." "What about?" "Not over the phone, just we need to have a conversation." I flew home the next day with a knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with turbulence. David was waiting in our living room when I walked through the door, sitting in the chair that faced the couch, a setup that immediately felt formal, confrontational. "Sarah, sit down." I remained standing. "What's going on?" "This isn't working." "What isn't working?" "This." He gestured vaguely around the room. "Us. This arrangement. You're never here. Jackson barely knows you anymore, and honestly, I feel like I'm married to a stranger." The accusations were so precisely wrong, so perfectly inverted that I almost laughed. Jackson barely knew me? I was the one who got up with him every night. I was the one who knew he liked his bottle warmed to exactly the right temperature, who could distinguish between his hungry cry and his tired cry, who had rearranged my entire professional life around his needs. "David, I've been gone for a total of 12 days in the past 4 months. You've been gone for 36. That's different." How is it different?" "Because my work supports this family. Your work, this case, it's like you're playing lawyer instead of being a wife and mother." Playing lawyer. As if my decade of education, my partnership track at a prestigious firm, my leadership of a major class action lawsuit was somehow less real than his consulting work. That's when I realized David had never seen me as his equal. I was a supporting character in his life story, and when I'd started writing my own story, he'd experienced it as a betrayal. "I see," I said quietly. "I've been thinking," he continued. "Maybe it's time for you to step back from the firm. Take some time to focus on Jackson. On us. You could always go back to work later when he's older." Later, when he's older. The same promise every woman gets, that her dreams will still be waiting for her after she's spent the best years of her career on hold. And what would we live on while I'm stepping back? "I make enough to support us. More than enough. You could pursue your interests, maybe do some volunteer work." "My interests?" "You know what I mean. Pro bono work, maybe. Something that doesn't require so much travel. Something that wouldn't threaten his position as the primary breadwinner. Something that wouldn't require him to be an equal partner in parenting." I looked at this man I'd married, this father of my child, and I saw him clearly for perhaps the first time. David wasn't asking me to step back because he thought it was best for Jackson or for our family. He was asking me to step back because my success made him uncomfortable. "No," I said. "Sarah, no, I'm not stepping back. I'm not putting my career on hold. I'm not pretending that your work is more important than mine." His face hardened. "Then maybe we need to think about whether this marriage is working." There it was. The threat I'd been expecting, delivered with the casual confidence of a man who assumed I needed him more than he needed me. "Maybe we do," I said. David didn't expect me to agree with him. He expected me to backtrack, to compromise, to choose him over my career like I always had before. When I didn't, when I just nodded and said maybe we should think about it, he looked genuinely shocked. "I didn't mean, I don't want a divorce, Sarah. I just want my wife back. I'm the same person I've always been." "No, you're not. You're different, harder, more selfish." Selfish. The word every woman hears when she stops putting everyone else's needs before her own. "I'm going to finish this case," I said, "and then we can talk about what comes next." But I already knew what came next. I'd known it the moment he'd tried to make me choose between my career and his comfort, between my dreams and his convenience. The final phase of the pharmaceutical case was a whirlwind of settlement negotiations, media interviews, and paperwork. We won, bigger than I dared to hope. The settlement would help thousands of people who'd been harmed by the company's negligence, and my role in the victory established me as one of the top pharmaceutical litigation attorneys in the state. David attended the press conference where we announced the settlement. He stood in the back of the room, watching me field questions from reporters, and I could see something in his face I hadn't expected. Pride. Genuine pride in what I'd accomplished. For a moment, I thought maybe we could find our way back to each other. Maybe seeing me succeed so publicly would help him understand what he'd been asking me to give up. "You were amazing up there," he said afterward as we walked to our cars. "Thank you. I know I haven't been supportive of this case. I was wrong about that. You did something really important here." I waited for the but. There's always a but when someone like David offers praise to someone like me. "But now that it's over, maybe we can get back to normal, focus on our family." There it was. "This is normal for me, David. This is who I am." "I know, but—" "There's no but. This is my career, this is what I do, and I'm good at it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "So what does that mean for us?" "It means you have a choice. You can be married to a successful attorney who sometimes travels for work, or you can be married to someone else. And Jackson? What about what's best for him? What's best for Jackson is having parents who respect each other. What's best for Jackson is seeing that both men and women can have careers they're passionate about. What's best for Jackson is growing up in a house where his mother isn't diminished to make his father comfortable." David stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. And maybe I was. Maybe the language of equality was foreign to him. "I need some time to think," he said finally. "Take all the time you need." David took 3 weeks to think. 3 weeks during which he was suddenly, miraculously available for childcare. He worked from home more often, scheduled fewer trips, even arranged for his mother to come help with Jackson when I had to travel for follow-up work on the pharmaceutical case. It was exactly the kind of partnership I'd been asking for, and it might have been enough if it hadn't come so late, so grudgingly, so obviously calculated to win me back rather than offered because he finally understood what I needed. "See," he said one evening after we'd put Jackson to bed together, the first time we'd shared that routine in months. "This can work. We can make this work. You're trying to prove something. I'm trying to save our marriage. By doing what I've been asking you to do for months? By suddenly being present when you think I might leave otherwise? I'm here now. Isn't that what matters?" But it wasn't what mattered, not anymore. What mattered was that he was here now because he was afraid of losing me, not because he valued me. What mattered was that it had taken the threat of divorce to make him consider being an equal partner. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." "Okay. If I hadn't taken the pharmaceutical case, if I hadn't started traveling, if I'd just continued handling everything at home while you maintained your schedule, would you have changed anything?" He was quiet for a long time. Too long. "I thought things were working," he said finally. "For you. For us. I thought we were happy. You were happy. I was drowning. I didn't know, because you didn't ask. In 3 years of marriage, you never once asked if I was happy with the arrangement. You never asked if I needed more help. You never asked what I wanted." Another long silence. "I'm asking now." It's too late. The words surprised me as much as they surprised him. I hadn't planned to say them, hadn't even realized I'd made the decision until it was out of my mouth. "Sarah, I want a divorce." What followed was the most civilized dissolution of a marriage you could imagine, at least on the surface. David, to his credit, didn't fight me on custody or finances. Maybe he understood that he'd pushed too far, asked for too much. Maybe he was just eager to get it over with. We agreed to joint custody of Jackson, with me having primary physical custody given that David traveled so much for work. We agreed to sell the house and split the proceeds. We agreed to maintain separate finances going forward, which was easy since we'd never really combined them anyway. What David didn't know was how much of our shared assets I'd already quietly moved into accounts he didn't have access to. Not illegally. Everything I did was perfectly legal and properly documented, but strategically. I'd opened new investment accounts in my name alone, transferring funds from joint accounts during the months when I was traveling for the pharmaceutical case. I'd redirected my direct deposit to a new bank entirely. I'd even taken out a life insurance policy on myself, with Jackson as the beneficiary, using money David assumed was going to household expenses. By the time we sat down with lawyers to discuss asset division, I had a much clearer picture of our finances than David did, and a much more secure foundation for my post-divorce life. "I don't understand," David said during one of our mediation sessions. According to these statements, our joint savings account has less than I thought. I showed him the records, legitimate transfers to legitimate investment accounts, documented expenses for Jackson's care, payments for household improvements that had increased the value of our home. You were traveling so much, I said calmly. I had to make some financial decisions without you. It was all true. It was also all part of a plan I'd been executing for months without fully admitting to myself what I was doing. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in March, exactly 9 months after Jackson was born. David kept his condo downtown, the one he'd been thinking about buying for months, ostensibly as an investment property, but really as an escape hatch. I kept the house, which I could afford on my own thanks to the pharmaceutical settlement bonus and the careful financial planning I'd done while he wasn't paying attention. I hope we can be friends, David said as we left the courthouse, for Jackson's sake. We'll be co-parents, I corrected. That's what Jackson needs. The first month of single motherhood was harder than I'd expected, but not in the ways I'd feared. Logistically, it was actually easier. I no longer had to coordinate my schedule around David's travel or pretend his last-minute changes didn't affect me. I no longer had to manage his emotional needs while managing everything else. But the loneliness was real. Not for David specifically, but for the idea of partnership I'd been chasing for so long. The dream of having someone to share the small moments with. Jackson's first tooth, his first word, which was mama, much to David's chagrin. The way he laughed when I made silly faces. I was sharing those moments, just not with David. Maria had become more than Jackson's nanny. She was like family. My parents visited more often now that they didn't have to navigate David's subtle disapproval of their middle-class mannerisms. My colleagues at the firm, freed from having to include David in social events where he'd inevitably make everything about himself, became genuine friends. I was building a different kind of support system. One based on mutual respect rather than obligated partnership. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I got a call that changed everything. Sarah Morrison? The voice was professional, confident. Speaking. This is Rebecca Chen from the Attorney General's office. I know we haven't met, but I've been following your work on the Meridian Pharmaceutical case. I'm calling because we have a proposition for you. The proposition was a job offer. Senior Deputy Attorney General, heading up the newly created Consumer Protection Division. It was a government position, which meant less money than private practice but more security, better benefits, and the chance to do exactly the kind of work I dreamed of when I went to law school. The only downside, Rebecca said, is that the position is based in Boston. I know you're in Springfield now. Boston. 2 hours from where I'd built my life, but a world away in terms of opportunity. Can I think about it? Of course, but Sarah, I should tell you, you're our first choice. This division is going to do important work, and we want you leading it. I hung up the phone and looked around my house, the house I'd fought to keep, in the town where I'd established my practice, near the support system I'd carefully built. Then I looked at Jackson, babbling happily in his high chair, smearing sweet potato across his face with the concentrated focus of a scientist conducting an experiment. What kind of life did I want to build for him? What kind of example did I want to set? I called Rebecca back the next morning. I'll take it. Moving to Boston required another careful orchestration, but I was getting good at those. I found a house in Cambridge, smaller than what I'd left behind, but in a better school district, with a yard where Jackson could play and enough space for a home office. I convinced Maria to come with us, offering her a raise and helping her find an apartment nearby. David was not pleased about the move. You can't just take my son to another state, he said when I told him about the job offer. I'm not taking him anywhere. You're welcome to visit him whenever you want. And Boston is only 2 hours away. My job is here. My life is here. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you made it clear that your job was more important than our family. The custody modification hearing was tense but brief. The judge was practical. Jackson was barely a year old. I was his primary caretaker, and the move was for a legitimate career opportunity that would benefit both of us. David would get extended summer visitation and alternating holidays. I hope you're happy, David said outside the courthouse. The Attorney General's office was everything I'd hoped for and more. The work was challenging, meaningful, and varied. One day I'd be investigating predatory lending practices. The next, I'd be prosecuting companies that sold fake medical devices to elderly patients. I was making a difference, protecting people who needed protection, using my skills in service of the public good. My colleagues were brilliant, passionate people who'd chosen government work because they believed in justice, not just profit. For the first time in my career, I wasn't the only woman in the room who was expected to take notes while the men made decisions. Jackson thrived in Boston, too. He loved our new house with its built-in bookshelves and sunny kitchen where he could play while I cooked dinner. He loved the park down the street where we'd go for walks after I got home from work. He loved Maria, who taught him Spanish songs and took him to story time at the library. At 18 months, he was walking, babbling constantly, and developing a personality that was pure joy to watch unfold. He was curious about everything, fearless in the way only toddlers can be, and affectionate in a way that made my heart ache with love. David visited every other weekend, as agreed. He'd take Jackson to children's museums and playgrounds, buy him expensive toys he was too young for, and return him Sunday evening with detailed reports of their adventures. "He's getting so big," David would say, as if surprised that children grow when you're not watching them every day. "He is. I miss him during the week." "You could move to Boston. There are consulting firms here." David would shake his head. "My career is in Springfield. I can't just uproot my whole life." The irony was apparently invisible to him. I'd been at the Attorney General's office for 6 months when I met James Fletcher. He was a public defender assigned to a case where our office was prosecuting a company that had sold faulty car seats. We ended up working together on victim outreach, and I was immediately struck by his competence, his compassion for the families affected, and his complete lack of ego about the collaboration. "You know," he said after a particularly productive meeting, "most prosecutors treat public defenders like we're the enemy. You actually listen to what I'm saying. Most public defenders I've worked with have good insights. Why wouldn't I listen?" He smiled. "You'd be surprised." James was nothing like David. Where David was all ambition and image, James was substance and service. Where David measured success by money and status, James measured it by the clients he'd helped and the injustices he'd corrected. Where David demanded attention, James earned respect. He was also a single parent. His 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, lived with him full-time after his ex-wife had moved to California and gradually faded out of their lives. "It's hard sometimes," he admitted over coffee after our third case together. "Being the only parent making decisions, handling everything. But Sophie's amazing. She makes it worth it." I understood exactly what he meant. James and I started having coffee regularly, then lunch, then dinner after work while our kids played together at his house or mine. Sophie was a thoughtful, intelligent girl who read constantly and asked questions that made me think. She was gentle with Jackson, patient with his toddler enthusiasms, and clearly adored her father. "Dad talks about you a lot," she told me one evening while James and I cleaned up after dinner and Jackson napped on the couch. "Good things, I hope. He says you're the smartest lawyer he's ever worked with and that you make him laugh." I looked over at James, who was loading the dishwasher with the methodical care of someone who'd been managing a household alone for years, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel again: the possibility of true partnership. David noticed the change before I told him about James. "You seem different," he said one Sunday when he was dropping Jackson off. "Happy. Happier than you were when we were married." "I am happy." "Because of the job." "Because of a lot of things." He lingered in the doorway, something he'd started doing lately instead of just handing Jackson off and leaving. "I've been thinking," he said, "about us, about the mistakes I made." "David, I know it's too late, I know that. But I want you to know that I understand now what I was asking you to give up, what I was taking from you." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever gotten from him, and it was more generous than I'd expected. "Thank you for saying that. Are you seeing someone?" The question was inevitable, but it still caught me off guard. "Yes." David nodded slowly. "Is it serious?" "It might be." Another nod. "Is he good to Jackson?" "He's wonderful with Jackson." "Then I'm glad. You deserve to be happy, Sarah. You deserve someone who sees how extraordinary you are. It was the most mature conversation we'd ever had, and it left me feeling something I hadn't expected: closure. James and I took our relationship slowly, carefully. We'd both been hurt by marriages that had promised partnership but delivered something else entirely. We'd both learned to be suspicious of grand gestures and passionate declarations. Instead, we built something steady, something based on showing up for each other day after day, something that grew stronger with each shared responsibility, each crisis weathered together, each small kindness exchanged. When Jackson got sick with a stomach bug that kept both of us home from work for 3 days, James brought soup and stayed to help, even though it meant Sophie might catch whatever Jackson had. When Sophie had a school presentation about her family and wanted to include Jackson in her poster, James asked my permission first, then helped her make a beautiful display that honored both her original family and the new one we were creating. "I love you," James told me on a Saturday morning 6 months after we'd started dating. We were in his kitchen making pancakes while the kids watched cartoons in the living room. It was domestic and ordinary and perfect. "I love you too," I said, and meant it in a way I wasn't sure I'd ever meant it before. "I want to marry you," he continued. "Someday. When we're both ready. When the kids are ready." "Someday," I agreed, but someday felt real in a way it never had with David. It felt like a promise we were both committed to keeping, not a fantasy we were hoping would work out. 2 years later, James and I were married in our backyard, surrounded by our kids, our friends, and our chosen family. Jackson, now 3, was the ring bearer, taking his job with the seriousness of someone entrusted with a vital mission. Sophie was my maid of honor, having declared that she was too old to be a flower girl, but too important to be just a regular bridesmaid. David attended the wedding at my invitation. It felt important for Jackson to see his parents supporting each other, even if we couldn't be together. David was gracious, polite, and genuinely happy for me in a way that suggested he'd done his own work on understanding what had gone wrong between us. "He seems like a good man," David said, watching James dance with Sophie while I held a tired Jackson. "He is. I'm sorry I wasn't. A good man, I mean. A good husband." "You were who you were. We both were." "I'm working on being better in my new relationship." I'd heard through mutual friends that David was dating someone, a fellow consultant who traveled as much as he did and seemed to understand his priorities. "I'm glad. Thank you for not giving up on the idea that I could be a good father, even when I wasn't being a good husband." It was true. Despite everything, David had grown into his role as Jackson's father. He was more present now, more engaged, more willing to adjust his schedule for important moments. Maybe the divorce had taught him something about what he could lose. Maybe becoming a weekend father had shown him how precious those moments with Jackson were. "Jackson loves you," I said. "That's what matters." 5 years after our divorce, David and I have found our rhythm as co-parents. He sees Jackson every other weekend and for extended time during summer and holidays. He's involved in school events when his schedule allows, and he's genuinely supportive of the life I've built with James. Jackson, now 6, moves easily between his 2 homes. He has David's confidence and curiosity, but also a kindness and emotional intelligence that I hope comes from seeing multiple models of how adults can treat each other with respect. Sophie is 11 now, brilliant and funny, and the best big sister Jackson could have asked for. She's teaching him to read advanced books and stand up for himself on the playground. James and I are in the process of adopting each other's children, a legal formality that recognizes the family we've already become. My career has flourished beyond anything I imagined when I was struggling to balance David's needs with my own ambitions. I've prosecuted major corporations, protected vulnerable consumers, and established precedents that will help people for years to come. I've testified before congressional committees, been quoted in national publications, and built a reputation as someone who fights for justice without compromise. But more importantly, I've built a life where my professional success enhances my personal happiness instead of competing with it. James and I share household responsibilities, childcare duties, and decision-making in a way that feels natural and equitable. When I have to travel for work, he steps up seamlessly. When he has a big case that requires extra hours, I adjust my schedule to cover. We're partners in the truest sense, and sometimes I look back at that night in the delivery room, holding Jackson while David's phone went to voicemail, and I'm grateful. Grateful that his absence forced me to recognize my own strength. Grateful that his neglect taught me to value my own worth. Grateful that his inability to be the partner I needed pushed me to find someone who could be. I learned that love isn't enough if it's not accompanied by respect, consideration, and genuine partnership. I learned that you can't compromise your way into a healthy relationship with someone who doesn't value what you're compromising. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and your children is to stop accepting less than you deserve. David recently got engaged to his consultant girlfriend. They're planning a wedding that sounds remarkably similar to the one he and I had, expensive, elegant, and entirely organized by his mother. I genuinely hope they'll be happy together, that she'll find in him what I couldn't, or that he's become the kind of partner she needs. As for me, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, in a career that challenges and fulfills me, in a marriage that supports and sustains me, in a family that was built on choice and commitment rather than obligation and assumption. That night, when Jackson was born and David didn't answer his phone, I thought I was losing everything. Instead, I was finding myself. I was discovering that I was stronger than I'd known, more capable than I'd believed, and deserving of more than I'd been accepting. The best revenge, they say, is living well. But this isn't about revenge. This is about recognition. Recognizing my own worth, my own power, my own right to be valued and respected and loved completely. I got everything I wanted in the end, just not in the way I originally thought I would, and that's turned out to be so much better than anything I could have planned.